Good evening, everyone. Kalisperasas. I hope you're all well. Allow me to begin today by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which we gather, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and we pay our respects to their elders past, present, and emerging. Welcome to tonight's presentation by Athens-based academic Professor Polymeris Voglis on political prisoners in 20th century Greece. However, before we resume, just some household items. As we enter winter, all the next few seminars in late June and early July will be online, so please look out for them. Specifically next week's Thursday, the 26th of June seminar will be by Professor Gonda van Steen on the battle for the bodies, hearts and minds in post-war Greece, the social worker Charles Schermerhorn in Thessaloniki 1946 to 1951. It should be an interesting seminar. Don't forget, there's a Kavafi for Beginners workshop that will take place in August. Spaces are limited. There are a handful of spots left, so enroll early while there's still some slots available. It will be delivered by Professor Michalis Bakoyannis from the Aristotelian University of Thessaloniki. Furthermore, for those who are members of the Greek community of Melbourne, or those who are eligible to renew their membership, election will be held at Alfred Grammar on Sunday, the 29th of June. So that's a Sunday week. Hope to see you there. Now let's return to tonight's topic, political prisoners in 20th century Greece. When most people hear the words Greek islands, the images that come to mind are pristine beaches, images of whitewashed buildings, particularly those with blue domes set against the backdrop of the sparkling blue Aegean Sea. Other common associations include sandy beaches, turquoise waters, picturesque villages, and ancient ruins. When imagining specific islands, the caldera views of Santorini or the vibrant nightlife of Mykonos are also iconic images that leap to the mind of most people. Now let me give you another set of images. Barren landscapes, scorching heat, rapes, assault, torture, cages, barbed razor wire, sadistic prison guards. These too are also Greek islands. And for a large part of the 20th century, these images were real, they were actualized, not just imaginary. Greece had a very turbulent 20th century. It struggled with democratic transition. Authoritarianism usually prevailed. It always lurked beneath the surface. This meant sidelining certain groups, especially those with political beliefs counter to the ruling authorities. In practice, this meant imprisoning and arresting those with leftist and communist sympathies. This persecution often extended to the families and relatives of those targeted as well. For those who avoided execution, banishment to remote and often uninhabitable islands became common practice. Islands like Makronissos and Aistratis have left a deep scar, a deep wound in the Greek national psyche. Political prisoners were subjected to physical and psychological torture, as well as forced labor to try to force them to renounce their political beliefs. There were repentance campaigns where prison authorities attempted to force prisoners to sign statements rejecting their political ideals and embrace Greek nationalism, often using the threat of continued imprisonment and violence. Today's talk seeks to shed light on this well-known but understudied dark side of Greek history. Now a few words about our invited guest. Polymeris Voglis is a professor of social history in the Department of History, Archaeology and Social Anthropology at the University of Thessaly. His undergraduate studies, his MA and BA, were at the University of Athens, while he obtained his PhD from the European University Institute. He's been a postdoctoral fellow at Princeton University and also New York University in the past. He has published widely and in different formats, but I'll only highlight two of his better-known works, Becoming a Subject, Political Prisoners During the Greek Civil War by Bergen Books in 2002, and we'll be circulating a link for those who are interested in purchasing this title, and also Η Αδύνατη Επανάσταση, η κοινωνική δυναμική του εμφυλίου πολέμου by Ekdos Alexandria 2014. This translates as The Impossible Revolution, the Social Dynamics of the Civil War, in this case the Greek Civil War. His academic interests concern the history of the 1940s, social history and political history, and he's a member of the board of directors of the Contemporary Social History Archives ASCII. There are many other accolades as well, but I won't go into them tonight. I pass on the baton to our invited guest, Professor Voglis.
Hi everybody. Good afternoon. Kalispera σας. Thank you very much for the invitation to give you a talk this afternoon. And thank especially Nick Dallas for contacting me and providing for this occasion. My talk this afternoon will be about political prisoners in 20th century Greece. Let me start by saying that we usually think of political persecution and political prisoners as an expected consequence of the so-called abnormal periods of Greek history. For example, we talk about the colonial dictatorship, 1967-1974, and among other policies of the regime, like censorship, banning of political parties, repression. We also add the political prisoners to document the authoritarianism of the regime. I believe that this idea of political prisoners is an abnormal phenomenon is based on a false premise. Let us think differently and take two things into account. The first is that the three periods that we consider, we call abnormal, that is the Metaxas dictatorship, the Greek Civil War, and the colonial dictatorship, add up more or less to 15 years. So we're not dealing here with an exception, with something different. It is something different that has continuity and duration. The second thing is that political prisoners also existed in normal, let's say, periods. That is both in the years of the interwar, but also in the years after the Civil War, that is the years we often call weak democracy, after the book by Elias Nikolakopoulos, Καχεκτική Δημοκρατία. That is the years between 1949 and 1967. So I think we're dealing with something different. Political prisoners are a phenomenon that runs through modern Greek history roughly from the 1920s to 1974. And moreover, I will argue that it is impossible to understand modern Greek history without taking political persecution into account. To get straight to the heart of my argument is that I will argue that in my talk that political persecution has been at the core of the state policies for half a century. Political persecution is not just one aspect of state policies, but constitutes the basic policy towards opponents. The persistence of political persecution and the long duration of the phenomenon show that the distinction between authoritarianism and democracy is much more problematic and debatable for a very large period of modern Greek history. Today, we think in, let's say, in a dichotomy. On the one hand, parliamentary democracy, and on the other, authoritarian rule. For about half a century, this dividing line between authoritarianism and democracy was blurred. Democratically elected governments had no problem resorting to persecution, deportation, imprisonment, and violence against their political opponents. Furthermore, political persecution is characterized not only by its long duration, but also by its continuity. Or to put it in more simple way, the legal arsenal that allows persecution was formed very early, as we will see, and applied for many decades. And the same also holds true for the penalties that were imposed. I will begin with the legislation. At the beginning of the 20th century, the persecution of political opponents was based on a law of 1871, a law that has been enacted for another purpose, namely to combat banditry. The law of 1871 allowed the authorities to deport relatives of bandits to isolated places, mostly islands. The penalty of administrative deportation, as it was called, the exile, was imposed not by courts but by public security committees that operated in each prefecture of the country, and these committees were staffed by the prefect, the commander of the gendarmerie, and the public prosecutor. In 1913, another law provided for the penalty of administrative deportation, that is, exile, not only for the relatives of bandits, but also for those suspected for disturbing public order. Based on these laws, the first socialists and trade unionists were deported, but this measure of exile was mainly applied at the height of the national schism, ethnikos dichasmos, for the deportation of either monarchists, supporters of King Constantine, or Republicans, that is, supporters of Venizelos. The real turning point in the legislation came a few years later with the Idionymo, which would become the mother, let's say, for all laws in the following decades. The Idionymo was passed by the liberal government of Eleftherios Venizelos in 1929 and stipulated that, I quote, anyone who seeks to implement ideas whose obvious aim is to overthrow the existing social system by violent means, or to separate part of the state from the whole, or who acts in favor of the implementation of such ideas through proselytism, could be, and that the penalty was, imprisonment for 6 months and deportation for 1 month up to 2 years. Furthermore, gatherings and associations that supported these ideas were banned, and civil servants would be dismissed. The Idionymo was directed against the Greek Communist Party. It had been founded in 1924 and advocated, let's say, revolution, the overthrow of the regime of the social existing social system by violence, and its position on an independent Macedonia, which the Communist Party had adopted the same year, that is 1924, after pressure from the Comintern, the Communist International, and the Bulgarian communists. In the years that followed, and until the dictatorship of Ioannis Metaxas, 95% of those found guilty of offenses against the security of the state were convicted under the Idionymo, and more specifically 2,850 citizens. These persons, these citizens were, those who were convicted were exiled to various islands in the Aegean Sea, such as Folegandros, Anafi, Kimolos, Naxos, Gavdos, etc. Political persecution intensified during the years of the Metaxas dictatorship. In terms of legislation, Metaxas followed the policy of previous governments, and the first relevant law Metaxas passed was a law in 1936, a month and a half after the dictatorship, which the law had the title on measures to combat communism and its consequences. a law that followed the spirit, let's say, of Indionym. However, Metaxas wanted also to be an innovator. And indeed, the next law, a law of in 1938, called on measures for the security of the social order and the protection of citizens, was in a sense pioneering because of the measures it provided. The measures that this law provided were applied on a very large scale during the Civil War a few years later. Three measures of the regime that were described in this law are worth mentioning. First, the first measure was declarations of repentance. Δηλώσεις μετανοίας, that is statements that in which communists renounced their political ideas and the Greek Communist Party. The second measure was the establishment of special prisons for communist political prisoners. These prisons in the law were called concentration camps. So a term that shows the influence of Nazi policy in Germany in the 30s. And the third measure were the so-called certificates of social beliefs, πιστοποιητικά κοινωνικών φρονημάτων. It was a certificate that for civil servants that in order to get a job, they should go to the police or the gendarmerie to get a certificate concerning their political beliefs. In fact, that they were not involved in subversive activities, trade unionism, and so on and so forth. Persecution during Metaxas years intensified. The islands of Folegandros, Anafi, Gavdos, Agios Evstratios, Kymolos, Sifnos, Paros, and Amorgos, among others, served as places of exile, while the majority of political prisoners were locked up in the prisons of Akronavplia, near Nafplion, Aegina, Pylos, and Corfu. It is difficult to estimate the number of political prisoners under Metaxas dictatorship. Some studies mention that something like 5,000 political prisoners. What we know for sure is that at the start of the Greek-Italian War in 1940, there were approximately 2,000 political prisoners and exiles. Political persecution reached its peak during the Civil War. We should not consider the culmination of political persecution simply as a result of the polarization that prevailed at the time. The huge number of political prisoners and exiles was not due to the special circumstances of the Civil War, but to the campaign by the post-war governments and the state apparatus to violently neutralize the left, which, due to the National Liberation Front and the resistance, had gained huge power in Greece in the 40s and threatened, or was considered threatening the regime. Moreover, the persecutions began the day after the signing of the Voglis Agreement in February 1945. That is well before the outbreak of the Greek Civil War and the appearance of communist guerrillas in the spring of 1946. In the first phase of the political persecution against the left, that is from February 1945 to March 1946, there was an outbreak of violence, which scholars describe as white terror. And in this period of time, something like 80,000 arrest warrants were issued, 50,000 citizens were arrested, and the number of political prisoners is estimated to be at least 10,000. During the Civil War, political persecution reached levels never before seen in Greek history, nor seen again in the post-war years. For this reason, I will focus a little bit more on this period to briefly examine three issues: legislation, the different categories of political prisoners, and the number of prisoners. The legislation of the Civil War years regarding political persecution of leftists is very complex, and I don't want to wish to go into details, so I will focus on the most significant of the so-called emergency measures. Two laws are very important. The first law was the third resolution, Tritoψήφισμα, in June 1946. That is less than 3 months after the elections that brought the royalist right to power and the government of Tsaldaris. The first article of the third resolution was based on the logic of Idionymon, but provided for much harsher penalties. According to the first article, anyone, I quote, who wishes to detach part of the whole of the territory, that's part of the from the Greek territory, or to facilitate plans aimed at this end, conspired or incited rebellion, or colluded with foreigners, or formed armed groups, or participated in such treasonous associations, shall be punished by death. Those who participated in armed attacks against authorities could also be sentenced to death. 2 years after the enactment of the third resolution, the government proceeded to establish 2 days, 2 days after the third resolution, the government proceeded to establish special military courts. That would these special military courts would be responsible for trying violations of the third resolution. The second law was Law 509 in December 1947, which this law passed 3 days after the proclamation of the Provisional Democratic Government, that's the government of the guerrillas of the Communist Party. The specific law 509 outlawed the Greek Communist Party and any other organizations involved in, I quote, treasonous rebellion against the integrity of the country. The law imposed heavy penalties, even death, even the death penalty, on anyone who, quote, sought to implement ideas whose obvious aim was the violent overthrow of the political system, the prevailing social system, or the separation of part of the territory from the whole. And it is exactly with the same wording that with the Idionymon of 1929. As I mentioned earlier, the above offenses, as well as more other violations of the so-called emergency measures, were tried by special military courts. According to a recent study, the special military courts issued a total of 50,291 verdicts. Of those who tried, about half were either acquitted or found not guilty, and of those who were sentenced to some form of punishment, 6,198 were sentenced to death. and 4,125 were sentenced to life imprisonment, and the rest to other, usually long-term prison sentences. In other words, if we exclude acquittals and dismissals, almost 1 in 4 of those convicted by special military courts was sentenced to death. The special military courts during the Civil War became notorious for their severity, and it is worth noting that there was no possibility of appealing for their decisions and their verdicts. This explains another dark chapter of the Greek Civil War, the executions. It is difficult to estimate, to calculate the total number of people who were executed during the Civil War. Based on my previous research in the British archives, I found that at least 3,400 people, political prisoners, were executed. Of them, 3,033 were sentenced by special military courts and 378 by criminal courts. Also, the vast majority of the executed were men. Generally speaking, only 13% of those who were brought to military justice were women. The first executions of political prisoners took place outside the Eptapyrgio prison in Thessaloniki. And these were two farmers from Kilkis. Their names were Theocharis Afranidis and Georgios Kalemis, who were executed on July 16th, 1946, 1 month after the third resolution. It is difficult to judge, to describe the whole system of military justice in the Greek Civil War. I would like to say that the special military courts functioned as a punitive mechanism of the state. Trials in general in special military courts had three characteristics. The first was that we're talking about mass trials and summary proceedings. That is, if I can explain more, is a large number of defendants were tried within a few days and many were sentenced to death, especially if they didn't sign declarations of repentance and did not betray their comrades to the authorities, or didn't reveal hideouts, and so on and so forth. Two of the most notorious trials were the trial of it was called narrow self-defense, stενή αυτοάμυνα, in August-September 1947, and the other was mass popular self-defense. This group was called mass popular self-defense, δηλαδή μαζική λαϊκή αυτοάμυνα, in November-December 1947. In these two trials, 140 persons were found guilty, 87 of whom were sentenced to death. The second, I should emphasize that a large number were sentenced to death or to heavy penalties, not because they were guerrillas of the Democratic Army of Greece, but because they were members of the Greek Communist Party or helped the party's illegal mechanism in the cities. One such mass trial concerned the so-called Prinzou case in Ioannina in July 1946. It concerned the teacher Eptapyrgio Prinzou, a leading member of the illegal Communist Party in Ioannina, and the offense was the illegal distribution of leaflets supporting the guerrillas. A total of 114 people were tried on charges of forming an illegal communist organization in violation of the emergency measures. The trial began on July 8th and ended 2 weeks later with the sentencing of 48 persons to death. A few days later, 16 of them were executed, including Eptapyrgio. An interesting detail among the military judges was a then unknown captain called Stylianos Patakos. And perhaps I should add that some executions were carried out in retaliation. That is, the aim was not to punish the guilty, but to intimidate society, especially leftists. Just one example. After the assassination of Minister of Justice Christos Lathas on May 1st, 1948, by a communist group in Athens, downtown Athens, 109 political prisoners were executed within 10 days, that is between May 1st and May 11th, 1948. Most of them had been convicted for crimes during the occupation, not the Civil War, and had been in prison for quite some time. Within this framework, it's not surprising that the number of political prisoners and exiles skyrocketed. Prisoners during the Civil War can be divided in three categories. The first category were the political prisoners who were convicted mostly by special military courts and to a lesser extent by criminal courts, and who served their sentences in numerous prisons throughout the country. The most well-known prisons were Eptapyrgio, Thessaloniki, Athens, Aegina, Kefalonia, Corfu, Kalami on Crete, but Pylos, Tripoli, Githio, Lamia, Volos, Trikala, Ioannina. The number of political prisoners was more or less remained consistently above 20,000 people. The problem was that the overcrowding of prisons. It is just to mention that before the war, that is in the late 1930s, the number of prisoners in Greece in general was more or less about 10,000 people. So we have a double prisoner population in Greece in the years of the Civil War. And because of that, the government decided to transfer the surplus population, prison population, to Giaros Island in the spring of 1947. And so we have prisoners in the mainland and about 8,000 prisoners on Giaros Island. The second category were political exiles. These were people who had been punished with administrative deportation, exile, by public security committees, and served their sentences on various islands in the Aegean until they gathered on Ikaria Island, Trikiri Island women, and then later Agios Evstratios. Their number was about 13,000, 15,000 people who were on exile after 1947. And the third and more obscure category of inmates were thousands of soldiers and some officers who had been imprisoned in the camps of Macronissos Island, which began operating in the spring of 1947. I should emphasize that these persons who were detained on Macronissos Island, they hadn't committed any crime. They were simply suspected of being leftists and were held in the Macronissos camps until they were re-educated, as it was called, through a combination of torture and propaganda. According to the commander of Macronissos, Colonel Georgios Bayraktaris, more than 25,000 soldiers had been reformed Macronissos by October 1949. In fact, the Macronissos experiment was considered so successful by the government that except soldiers, also male and female political exiles were transferred to the camp in order to convert them to become national-minded, as they were called back then, and renounce the Greek Communist Party. After the end of, I don't know if, okay, after the end of the, and these are some pictures, some photographs from the Macronissos camp. Let me say that there is a digital museum where you can see the others, the link, www.macronissos.org, where you can, there is a, I was involved in this project to create something like a digital museum if you want to have more information on Macronissos Island. And you can visit this website. Again, these are photographs from Macronissos and inmates. After the end of the Civil War, the number of political prisoners and exiles decreased dramatically. However, there were executions, and I refer here to the executions of Nikos Belogiannis, who was executed on charges of espionage along with 3 of his comrades in 1952. Also of Nikos Nikiforidis in 1951, Nikos Plubidis in 1954. And although the number of political prisoners and exiles decreased, persecution and imprisonment continued. From 1950 to 1962, when the last political exiles were released, approximately 4,200 leftists had been deported. The coup d'etat of April 21st, 1967 was accompanied by mass campaign of arrests, the vast majority of whom were leftists. In the first hours of the coup, 8,270 citizens were arrested by the police, the gendarmerie, and the army throughout Greece, of whom 6,118 were deported to Yaros Island because, according to the regime, they belonged to the category of dangerous communists. After September 1967, began the release, the gradual release of political prisoners. In 1969, there were 1,874 exiles in various places like Key, Partheni, which is Leros Island. Also that, unfortunately, we don't have a systematic research, historical research on the political prisoners during the years of colonialist dictatorship. Anyway, according to data submitted by the Greek embassy to the American government, between 1967 and 1971, special military courts tried 3,363 people and then sentenced, out of them, 2,045 citizens. Most of them were convicted under Law 509 of December 1947, even in cases that the defendants were not members of the Communist Party, even when they belonged to the center. Many groups of resistors during the dictatorship were not from the left, were from the center. But even those people were sentenced under law 509. I will. I think that I'm talking too much. I will skip some things, and I would like to say a few words about the experience of prison. The first is that the two characteristics of the experience of prisoners, of political prisoners. The first is the torture, the violence. We cannot describe or discuss the experience of political prisoners without taking into account the physical and psychological violence they suffered. These persons, men and women, suffered in prisons, detention centers, interrogation rooms, and military camps. Torture was intertwined with the experience of political prisons, and it was an extreme experience, a borderline experience, because they were literally at the mercy of their torturers. Beatings, forced labor, thirst, what was called back then airplane, electric shocks, bastinado, standing for hours, burning of the body with cigarettes, rape. It's a long, list of tortures that they suffered in order to what they call to break them, or to spasm. That is to crush their spirit and undermine their identity. I have here a quote from a description recently was published this book here. It's called. It was written by Dimitris Efadis, based on records from the public psychiatric hospital, and it has the let's say the descriptions of psychiatrists about detainees, about prisoners from Macronissos camps. And I have some quotes that describe very not accurate, but vividly their situation. In one case, the psychiatrist wrote, "He remains motionless in his chair, except for his head, which droops and trembles to the side. He often brings his hands to the back of his head and says, 'My head, my head.' And the patient says, 'I was working well at my uncle's shop when some civilians came and took me to Macronissos.' He can remember nothing else. He also doesn't recall having been here before. It seems as if he hasn't lived his life from the moment of his arrest onwards." And the second is from a testimony of a person who was beaten. His name is Tassos Minis, and he published his book. It was translated in German and published in Greek after the fall of the dictatorship in 1975. And in this, he described his torture at the hands of the military police, SA. I guess you can read it, and I don't want to. And the other thing that is worth mentioning, and it is characteristic of political prisoners, is their the collective organization of their life in prison and exile. If the aim of the prison and the camp administration was to break down political prisoners as a collective subject, political prisoners themselves organize their life collectively in order to strengthen the bonds between them and their collective identity. This is a picture on the left from Agios Evstratios, political exiles. Agios Evstratios, at the tents that you can see the tents that they were living, and then is a poster from the years of the 67-70 for the junta, for the liberation of political prisoners. So we have the organization. The collective organization was aimed at cultivating, to organize daily life, fill what is called the empty time, adios chronos, in prison, heal the physical and psychological wounds of those who had been tortured, to educate and also indoctrinate, of course, them politically, to create a collective identity, and that they were, these people who were in prison were political prisoners, were not just prisoners, they were political prisoners. And for this reason, there's many activities within the prison walls, like lessons, sketches, celebrations. They organize appeals, they write appeals, they send appeals to political parties, the press, and also in the years of the Greek Civil War, they organized hunger strikes for the in order to stop the execution of political prisoners, again in the Civil War. In conclusion, the phenomenon of political prisoners was not something temporary or simply a consequence of an abnormal period. On the contrary, it runs through much of Greece's history in the 20th century, showing that for about 50 years, half a century, the boundaries between democracy and authoritarianism were blurred, that the persecution and imprisonment of political opponents was at the core of state policies. The history of political prisoners does not only concern the tens of thousands of families who experienced persecution in one way or another, nor does it only concern political parties. It is a chapter of modern Greek history, a past that we as a society, have the maturity to study, discuss, and investigate. I will finish with something about the presence of the past in Greece today. Let me show you a photograph. This photograph comes from mass graves that were recently discovered, that is in March and May, near Eptapyrgio prison in Thessaloniki. More specifically, during works of the municipality of Sikees, Neapoli, that was called the municipality, 6 mass graves containing the remains of 40 skeletons were discovered. The discovery is shocking. It once again confronts us with the painful past of the Civil War. It is, I say painful because what we realize is that those who were executed were literally dumped. After the execution, their clothes and shoes were removed and they were thrown into a makeshift pit with no indication that there was a grave, without their names being mentioned, without their families being able to mourn them and bury them. I believe that as historians we have a duty to investigate this dark chapter of the Greek Civil War in order to find out where, who, and how political prisoners were executed. I believe that as a society we have a duty not to abandon these dead people to oblivion and obscurity. We know that the mass graves at the Eptapyrgio prison are just the tip of the iceberg. It is time for initiatives to be taken by municipalities and researchers to identify as many of those executed as possible by studying military court and prison records as well as the press. It is important that these dead who fell from the bullets of the firing squads be given a name and cease to be unknown. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Voglis, for that very informative presentation. I'm sure you've left a lot of us with many troublesome thoughts. I'll probably kickstart off the question time with a few questions of my own. You mentioned the special military courts, which in very short time made a lot of those decisions to execute a lot of the prisoners. As a historian or as an average citizen, do we have archives? Do we have access to the archives of those special courts, the decisions that were made? Can those archives be accessed? What's the situation?
The special military courts archives. There was a study. Unfortunately, it's not public. I mean, I have it, but I asked for the persons who did the study to send it to me, to send me the PDF. But there was a study by a group of researchers in 2022, and this group was a research project, in fact, funded by National Center for Social Sciences, I think Κέντρο Κοινωνικών Ερευνών, and they studied the archives of special military courts, and they have at least now we have a very good picture of their decisions, of the sentences, because they were throughout Greece. So each special military court, the decisions that they had, we have summaries of the proceedings, the trials. So there is we have a much better picture of what happened with the military justice in the years of the Greek.
So some researchers have special access, but not the general public at this stage. But some researchers do. Generally, you're saying. Yeah, I think you've just.
Yeah. Okay. But now it is. They are stored in a place called in Athens called Roof. That is where the military records for military justice records are kept. So I don't know. Perhaps if someone wants to do research or find something about a person or a city, probably he or she will have access.
My second question is, you mentioned some fairly gruesome figures. Do we also have figures with regards to during Nazi occupation of Greece, those who actively collaborated with the Nazi German regime? How many of those were tried and executed? Do we have some comparative figures when we do a comparison?
You mean who were tried executed by the Germans?
Yeah, who were actively collaborating with the Germans, and after the war,
Okay.
on
Well,
trial.
the question of collaboration. Okay.
Yes.
Um, as you know, and probably most of you know Greeks know that this is a very an easy topic. That on the one hand there was collaboration and armed collaboration with, especially with the Germans, and on the other hand, after the liberation, there was no punishment, to put it very briefly, for the armed collaboration. There are some cases that, especially of leaders, that they were executed, like Georgios Poulos or notorious Fritz Schubert, who in fact was not Greek. But in general, very few were tried, and even less were sentenced to heavy sentence or death. Most of them, most of the persons who of the Nazi collaborators who were sentenced were out of prison in 1952.
Okay.
And this is a very, sad story, embarrassing, in fact, embarrassing story.
We have a question from Aphrodite Boukidis. It seems there was no real public truth and reconciliation process in Greece. Basically, there was no closure, I presume she's saying. Do you think there's a need for this in Greece, especially with the recent discoveries of the mass graves in Thessaloniki? Thank you for your presentation.
I think, as some of you probably know, there was a debate in Greece in the beginning of after 2000, and there was a controversy, historians' controversy, and loads of books and published and articles were published regarding, in general, the 1940s, that is, occupation and civil war and resistance. So I think, in many conferences and public debates and movies, so I think that we are ready to face this difficult past, um, and to discuss without fear what happened in the 1940s, especially in the Civil War. And for instance, this story with the mass graves in Eptapyrgio prison, there was a huge interest. There was no debate, like, the murderers and so. No, there was a true interest to find out who they are, who they were, in fact. These prisoners who were executed, what happened, but without the heat or the passion or the of the past. So I think with the we're more or less mature as a society to face this past. It's like 70, 80 years behind us.
Yeah, the next, I think it's more comment than a question, is that we have to be open about discussing the Civil War, and otherwise we'll never sort of overcome it. A question from Chris Georgiadis: What efforts are being made to identify the bodies recently discovered in mass graves? Are they using DNA testing, testing their families? Have some efforts started? I'm just talking about the bodies at Eptapyrgio.
According to the information that I have, because I'm not involved in this part of, let's say, it's not a research, but I'm not involved in DNA testing. I know that some of the families, members of the families, of relatives of those who were executed in Eptapyrgio prison, outside the Eptapyrgio prison, had given the DNA samples in order to be able to identify um, the to match the DNA of, um, of the skeletons.
Yeah.
We don't know yet. It's an ongoing process because it's very recent. I know that there are many sides involved, many, let's say, many protagonists, many parties involved, the municipality of the specific municipality, political parties, the Greek Communist Party. So they have relatives that they're interested in identifying the DNA of the skeletons. So it's in the process through DNA and identification, but I don't know to which stage we are now.
Yeah. I mean, you almost need a pool of DNA samples from relatives who come forward voluntarily and provide their DNA so there can be some cross matching down the track. But we'll see where this goes. Just one more question. It's more a technical question. No doubt, all those that were tried and so forth. Do we have any examples where some might have been of Cypriot background? And if they were Cypriots, how were they treated? As other Greeks or differently because they were British subjects?
British subjects?
Well,
What do you
the
mean?
Cypriots, I mean, they would have been in this process of the trials. Were there any Cypriots involved, and were they just treated as Greeks, or were they treated as British subjects if they were from Cyprus? Or have you come across anything in your research? And
No, no. I know. I don't know. I don't haven't come across this thing. So unfortunately, I'm not. So
no, not to worry. Just in case you came across an example or two. Yeah, okay. I think we might bring proceedings to the close because we're past the hour. Thank you very much, Professor Vogli. Hopefully, we might have you again sometime in the future, either again
Yes.
online or even in the flesh in Melbourne. Always welcome here to visit the Greek Centre, and best of luck with any future research. Thank you once again.
Okay. Bye bye.